All right. Hey, guys. Looks like we're live. Welcome to another Note to File podcast live. Music is still trying to play. There we go. I think I got it stopped. Looks like our guest is not quite here yet, but no worries. Sure, we have plenty to talk about. I just got back from Magi last week, which was really cool. And I learned a lot. I haven't gone out to a big conference in quite a while. So it was pretty cool to get out, meet some people I haven't met before. Shout out to Danielle Mitchell, Quincy Birdsong, Lovey Negrin. Got to meet a lot of folks out there. I was pretty excited about it. I had an opportunity to speak, which was cool, and I got to actually do sort of a more debate style panel that was between me and a CRO contact about hidden site costs and hidden sponsor costs, and kind of turned out with a lot of me complaining about the stuff sites have to deal with. Anyways, again, it was really cool. If you're out there, feel free to leave some comments. Looks like our guest Craig has not quite made it yet. Haven't heard anything from him, so I'm just going to keep on jabbering a little bit until he makes his way here. I've been a little bit slow in my my podcast drops lately, so apologies for that. Between traveling and somehow managing to get sick over and over again over the last month, it's been a challenging proposition, but I've got several banked and ready to come out. If there's anything you're ever interested in hearing about on the podcast, I'd really love to hear from you guys. I do this stuff because I like doing it, and I think I think it's useful for the community. But I really want to hear what you guys want to hear about, and so I can sort of be of value to you guys. Was the audience receptive to your comments, Leanne? Thank you for the question. I assume you're talking about the Magi. I think so. It was actually really interesting to sort of, first of all, understand and know that like a lot of sites are going through the same problems. They have the same questions. They have the same uncertainties when it comes to budgets and contracts. Specifically, the budget side is where we really were kind of focusing on. But what was also interesting to see is that there were both, sort of CRO and sponsor folks around, and it was interesting to hear. There's sometimes a little bit of a disconnect, I think, sometimes between CRO and sponsor in terms of knowing like exactly what's going on, and also even what they're sort of like willing to work with sites on. So a couple positive things I took away was that for the most part, I'm of course being told that sponsors want to pay you what you feel you're worth, but that does require a certain level of justification and sort of work on the site side, which we all know is a pain in the ass. It can be challenging to write up letters upon letters and constantly be justifying the costs that we endure. But it was encouraging to hear some sponsors say that there are even instances where they would be willing to renegotiate some things because it's an unpopular opinion, but like I've said, look, I think we shouldn't finalize or we shouldn't finish our budgets until after SIV, because so many things seem to happen that we just simply don't know about until we're sometimes far along, and those are costs that we're just going to eat as a site. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of recourse. So honestly, the audience was receptive, but because a lot of them were sites, and as I'm representing the site side, it was pretty easy for them to sympathize with that. But again, I was actually pretty surprised to hear how receptive sponsors can be in terms of listening to sites and even potentially renegotiating things as they come up. So no, I appreciate the question, Leanne. And it looks like Craig has arrived, so I'm going to throw him up here. Craig, how's it going, man?
I'm doing well.
Awesome, awesome. Glad to see you. You've been in this game for a while. Let me. I want to hear a little bit about your background and kind of the sort of
Yeah, a little
breadth
bit.
of.
I set the auto. I set the lights to not go on, so you didn't see my gray hair, but apparently you can see it. Yeah, it's been over 20 years. I was kind of raised in pharmacy. Every pharmacist said to be a doctor. Every doctor said be a pharmacist, and I was like, I'm going to get into clinical. Her first role right out of college when hiring was pretty good was immediately at Shearing Plow when they still existed, and it was doing some data entry type stuff for a bunch of different ClinOps documents. Then it was helping monitors get them and retrieve them, and huge paper like library bins. It was just so archaic now in retrospect. But stayed there only for a little while. Friend went to Pfizer and kind of lured me over there, and that was a bunch of fun. And off we went. But yeah, 20 years. I'm at actually very, very recently left sort of the large pharma side, and I'm at Flatiron Health. So I'm in the city here a few days a week, and the rest in New Jersey. But yeah, excited to be here today, Brad. To
Yeah, man.
chat.
Appreciate you. Yeah, I appreciate you coming on. What do you tell us a little bit about what you're doing at Flatiron?
Sure. So, with their acquisition of Protocol First, I guess it was a little under a year ago, they launched a clinical research business unit. I actually initially thought that purchase was going to be geared towards the EHR business at Flatiron, and it ended up being kind of a surprise to me that they launched this business unit. So, kind of very, very recently, just saw apparently had the need for a commercial leader. So I came in as the head of commercial and partnerships for the clinical research business unit. So, have a team of sales, business development people, some BD ops, as well as people focused on relationships with big customers where you have to sort of weave through lots and lots of complexity to hopefully hiring soon for someone that's going to be focused on vendors, including CROs and other tech providers, to uh, hopefully
I think I lost you. Well, I don't know if it's my connection or yours, but you've definitely frozen up. So I'm going to give a quick refresh and see if that fixes us up a little bit here. Wow, looks like we lost Craig, and looks like my connection crapped out, or maybe his, but unfortunately, this isn't the first time that's happened. So, get Craig another second to come back here. It's always technical difficulties, isn't it? The last few streams have gone well. The first couple, I had some technical problems, and then the last few have gone really well, and then here we are again. So we'll give Craig another second here. Thank you. I couldn't tell. It locked up there, and I couldn't tell if it was me or him or who. So we're doing the best we can. Appreciate you guys guys hanging tight. I feel bad for Craig because coming on and getting chopped off like that. So what's coming up? CNS? Anybody out there going to CNS? I mean, unfortunately, I'm not able to make it. It looks like it'll be fun. Looks like there's gonna be a lot of folks there. I've never been to one, so I don't really know that much about it, frankly. Always curious to hear from people who have been able to check it out. Talk a little bit more about Magi. I'll wait for Craig. I mean, Magi was cool. Again, I hadn't been out in so long, so it was just kind of a lot at once for me. But I sat in on a couple interesting talks. One about the concept of whether or not clinical research should be considered a care option. I mean, I know that CRACO, or clinical research care option, is kind of a term that's been thrown around by not just, I know Javar is kind of well associated with it, but it seems like it's been more broadly used. And I thought it was pretty interesting. It was actually really interesting to hear that the people that were on stage seemed to be very in favor of the concept of CRACO, while you had a lot of sites in the audience who were kind of pushing back on the idea, which, I've gone back and forth over the years myself. I tend to think more now that it's more useful to not consider clinical research a care option per se, for a number of different reasons. I mean, you've got kind of obvious things like, therapeutic misconception that, it could be confusing for patients to not understand the difference between care and research, or treatment and research, which are, two very distinct things. But I also found, like, when I worked in a hospital system previously, I think the administration really misunderstood the difference between research and treatment. And in some ways, it handicapped carrying out research. They wanted to make it very in line in terms of, only nurses could administer drug. Well, in research, a coordinator can administer investigational product, or they can dispense it. But, in the hospital, it's like they really wanted to only have nurses take care of that. So that was, challenging to only hire nurses in your research department. And I'm going to cut that off. Craig's back. Sorry, Craig. I don't know if it's your
So that's the way that we solve all our problems.
Perfect.
There's some widespread AWS thing happening in the city. There's a bunch of businesses complaining about their Wi-Fi. So sorry about that.
That's okay. I can never tell if it's me or not. I mean, I think my connection's decent today, so
yeah.
I'm going to blame you this time. So sorry, let's go backwards a little bit. I want Protocol First was acquired by. So what was Protocol First an EDC? Is that right, or am I off base there?
Yeah, basically an EDC system, a remote source upload system, some digital protocol tech capabilities, and then sort of the most novel thing that a lot of people kind of were talking about is clinical pipe, which is the FHIR-based EDC or EHR to EDC product.
Okay. Yeah, I got two routes I want to go down here. One is like, so what do you see the future of EDC? I mean, is EDC a sort of is it on its way out in terms of how we envision EDC? Is direct data capture the future, or are these things like clinical pipe that sort of can extract that data going to become more ubiquitous to the point to where EDC is not really another system where we're, right now we may be writing down data from an EHR on a piece of paper and then typing it into an EDC. Like, do you see that paradigm really shifting significantly?
As the head of commercial of owning an EDC system, I have to say it's going to be around here forever. We should all use it all the time. I actually think that the big thing in the next maybe 10 years is going to be that EDC will still be around, but I actually think that EHR is going to right now EDC could become EHR is going to a next jump downstream system like a clinical data repository that has some EHR data, maybe some EDC data, but central labs, radiology reports from a central reader, central EKGs, wearable sensors, stuff like that. So I think EDC will still be around, but it will be increasingly just one of the many data sources that we need to analyze to prove safety and efficacy. And the question for ops teams, from my perspective, is, all right, well, what place do we go to actually make sure that our data are fit for purpose, are high quality? And instead of going into each one of those individual systems to do SDR, certainly not SDV, but SDR, what systems do we use to, have an overlay of risk-based monitoring? I think that's actually going to be the CDR world. I think that, there's a few companies out there that have those products, but I don't think that negates for foreseeable future, perceived need for an EDC system. I also speak in terms of large pharma needs often as sort of a representation, but there's tons of small pharma companies with, 2 people, a dog, and a molecule, and they're not going to buy a clinical data repository. They have no need for it. They'll go to a CRO and they'll contract directly with some data capture vendor. There's I think something like 7,000 or 8,000 pharma companies out there, and we often talk about the top 10 or 20 and try to have them represent the rest, but it's quite a heterogeneous mix there.
Sure. Actually, I want to jump into this question from Nelson because I was going to kind of go down this road as well. Look, I have my thoughts about EHR integration. We talked about it a little bit offline, the other day. So EHR integration is having a meaningful impact on enrollment speed. I mean, is that something that we will see? And if so, sooner rather than later?
So top of mind, Nelson, a great question, and thank you for it. I don't think of the value prop of EHR to EDC, specifically that, as driving enrollment speed either way. EHR integrations in a broader sense, particularly if you had access to a whole bunch of data and you're able to actually analyze that data for protocol design use cases or use case, or even like a little further downstream in terms of screening and just being able to essentially know if a site will have good potential or not for a particular protocol. That marriage of a good protocol representing reality with, enrollment estimates being replaced with actual data-driven decisions on which sites to use, that will, I think, fundamentally shift the enrollment curve.
Yeah, well, and I think he may be talking about sort of, because I know there's 2 different kind of tales here. One is that, there's a huge increase in these EHR abs, I don't even know what to call them, EHR, scrapers that help identify patients based off of inclusion and exclusion criteria that are using, maybe they're searching unstructured and structured data. And that seems to be a huge rise in these types of companies or vendors right now. But then I think where you're living is more in a EHR to EDC type world. Is that more accurate? Is that accurate?
Yeah, it's a current product that's commercialized and being used on a myriad of studies at 20 or so very large institutions, with another 80 or so coming online by the end of the year. So that's one of the worlds. Another is with Flatiron's heritage of real world data. I don't think we would want to miss the chance of building something or sort of productizing something that does look at the data within, let's say, the Onco EMR world, right? So all those real world data sets that have been traditionally used for real world evidence purposes, let's use them in the clinical trial optimization world and see what the highest value applications are of that. In my estimation, it's two places. One is on designing a protocol, and there's certainly some companies out there that do that, although don't specifically own the data in the way that there's ownership. Not obviously patients own their data, but in terms of usage of it for protocol design purposes, that's one area, and the other is being able to basically do site selection based on a data-driven approach. I'm not talking data-driven in some sort of ubiquitous way. I'm talking about the weather forecast says it's going to be 95% chance of rain. I will bring an umbrella. Like human beings are data-driven without even realizing it. So I think those are going to be the two kind of bigger areas where we can really leverage the tons and tons of data that we have that frankly there's a fraction of it that's been abstracted. So I think if we get better doing that, which we are, and some colleagues not in clinical research are working on that, it's going to be an enormous I think help for sponsors and CROs.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's always hard for me to wrap my head around from the site level, I think. And again, we talked about this, like our model and a lot of others out there. I mean, we're working with a lot of different providers with different EMRs, and it gets sort of challenging to determine how useful it is to have all these backdoors or APIs or whatever the case may be. I mean, first of all, it's a pain in the ass to even get them connected, if that's a possibility, especially with some of the bigger institutions we work with. But I mean, do you think that's I don't know, do you think it's an easier proposition for a large institution who manages their own trials versus these more rising IROs or sort of site management organizations, or is that it'll become a little bit easier over time?
Yeah, maybe I'll give an example. So with the upper 200s, low 300s amount of onco EMR sites that we have, about a quarter of them, so 80, 85, are like research ready right now. Those are sites that are not your, they run 5 studies a year sites, but they're certainly not the larger, AMCs. These are oncology practices that are community oncology practices, but also do research. Going out to those sites, because they're in a myriad of places, whether it's a large city, which can be very diverse, or not a large city, which might not be diverse, but going out to that sheer number of sites that could be picked by a site management organization to be involved in a study, there's huge want from them to have something like Clinical Pipe, and that's why basically we're deploying it as quickly as possible in the next couple months. Contrast that against you and some of the work that you're doing. The variability in all these different systems becomes more of a pain, and it becomes perceived as a pain, and so the value prop might simply drop there. Even with something like Clinical Pipe, it's TA agnostic, but simply stated, the more study data you have for mapped, quote unquote mapped variables, the greater the value prop. And so that brings in things like, well, oncology is the prime example of the perfect study, speaking specifically for structured data. We're talking 50 to 70%, right, including local labs. Everyone knows local labs are beyond a pain. And then, so there's huge value there, not to mention the unstructured data, which is soon to be a reality for a close to 100% ability for a site to push a button and have it appear in an EDC system. So there's a lot of excitement there from the site side. I guess ignoring maybe the IT groups that can often they either want to build their own, or they don't want to be bothered with another integration, or Ignoring that world, and we try and white glove it as much as possible there. But ignoring that world for a second, the actual site user, I think, enjoys it quite a lot to be able to have their day freed up from some of the more monotonous administrative stuff. But again, these are different archetype sites than a site like yours. So
Sure. Well, and I'm interested too in what about the the sites like the OncoEMR sites who don't have or aren't research ready, right? I mean, it seems like that would also be a really great tool to decide who are good candidates to be research ready. Who does it make sense to make research ready, right?
Well, that's right. And this is it's not a tough answer, but it's there's a reason why they're not doing research. A lot of physicians simply have no interest in research, and it's hard to get past that that objection, right? Like, you can't make me do research. Those that want to but don't have the infrastructure and have a real interest in it, I do think there's a solution where someone like Flatiron can provide, coordinator as a service type option. There was, a recent presentation, I believe, at where was it? It was summer, one of the conferences recently, and where there was some talk about that. So, it's early days, but I think that if sites really want to be research sites and they have specific, very solvable hurdles, I think we might have an answer there. Because one of the things, and I mentioned it 2 minutes ago, but one of the things that we have to do is simply have representative sample in our study of population. The assumption has been that that's been going on since, for the last, several decades, but the reality is it's not. And so for any given study, for any given disease, we want to have as close to a representative sample as reflective of the population. I don't think you get that purely by going to the same players that you've gone to for the past 20 years.
No, but I guess to the whole point of this, I mean, you can sort of reverse engineer that, right? And say, well, we know that this type of patient is here, so we can spin up a site, based off the data that you have. And that's, seems to make a lot of sense to me. And there's a lot of, even what I'm doing is not necessarily dissimilar. And the Javaras and Circuit Clinicals of the world, are all kind of chasing that same basic model. But maybe for me, at least, it's probably a little less data driven just because of, people like you have that data, not necessarily me. So, but again, it seems like it would be, I wouldn't say easy, but it would make a lot of sense to reverse engineer that, right?
Yeah. And just thinking out loud here was, when we look at the saturation of EHRs in terms of market share, the Cerner, obviously bought by Oracle, but Cerner, Athena Health, Epic, obviously, and I'm blanking on the fourth one, but they occupy like 72% of the market. So the other, the delta of 30 is something like some ridiculous number, like 500, 600, 700 different EHRs. I mean, there's a lot of EDC systems, but it's in the manageable low double digits. If you really press, maybe like 25 or 30. The EHR world's so different. So, if my friend Irfan up at Circuit Clinical, if I'm not sure what EHR they use, but if it was something that was not one of those four, and kind of one of the ones that maybe you haven't heard of, maybe technically impossible currently to do an API call with that, like, then something like Clinical Pipe isn't suitable for them, right? But
Sure.
But in terms of those models, one huge benefit to someone like a Circuit, or obviously Protocol First, or Flatiron with the OncoEMR sites, is these sites as care centers, as collection of physicians and nurses, can, to me, so much better know their patient population and be way more hands-on than certainly some of the big names. And I really think that, people in the, like Buffalo region for Circuit Clinical as an example, like I think they do much, much better job of explaining to patients and getting, I wouldn't call it the right patients in, but patients that will fit a study, patients that can get sort of a white glove treatment. Except for the pandemic shining a light on clinical research, no one knows how drugs go from a lab to a medicine cabinet.
Right.
It's, if you ask the average person on the street, no clue whatsoever, none. It's slightly better in the past couple of years. We have more of a trust problem than we did in the past, sadly. But some, those IROs or those even SMOs, your site virtually guaranteed does a better job of getting better patients that are better fit to stay in the study longer, that actually, know what they're getting into with a, nicely explained, informed consent. So I see a lot of value in those places, just in terms of delivery for patients.
Sure. Yeah. No, I wouldn't necessarily disagree. Let's take a couple questions here. So I don't even know how to begin to answer this, but how long until someone with access to public verifiable data, such as, I guess, CTGov start and stop dates, for example, can see that integrations actually speed enrollment or make a drug more likely to get approved? I mean, I assume we're at least seeing that, or hoping that we're seeing that, but maybe there hasn't been as much uptake as we'd like to see. But what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm just kind of rereading it.
Sorry, I can throw it back.
No, it's okay. Yeah, I think there's probably a few companies out there that utilize something like CT.gov. Actually, one just came out of stealth and raised a few bucks. Power, but basically, you're able to, as a patient, you're able to search for condition and see kind of what and who are conducting the, where the trial is being conducted. Like actually get in touch with the study team, actually get in touch with a coordinator, not be routed to like a central screening, but really just get like that done kind of up front and get right to a site if you qualify and if you want to. I think that is a great thing. The bearish outlook goes back to the education piece, which is how many patients are not just Googling their disease, but they're trying to get into a clinical trial for their disease or whatever they're, whatever they're suffering from. So it becomes this question of, well, who is best suited to help patients? And I really do think it's those more local community, care centers, that, versus a patient Googling, psoriatic arthritis and seeing that there's clinical trials for it, but they've yet to see a dermatologist or a rheumatologist. So why would they, common sense wise, why would they go towards a clinical trial?
And we see the interesting distinction too with, obviously to your point, I think patients with the trusted physician tend to be a lot more engaged. They do tend to make better, clinical research subjects, and they're more open to it, and all this stuff that you would believe to be true. But oftentimes the people who need it the most are the people who don't have that relationship with a doctor. You know what I mean? And I guess that's tricky too, because, clinical research is not treatment, right? I mean, I guess you can call it a care option. That's another debate I was talking about a little earlier when we kind of fell offline there. But, oftentimes we find those are the people those are the ones seeking out clinical research as an option for them, or that don't have a great, don't have a physician or don't have a relationship with a care center of some kind. And, that's challenging in its own right. But I mean, I think again, to your point, in terms of scaling out, research in a way that it's most accessible, I think it does have to be through those local community physicians, really.
Yeah, I mean, when I think about what you just said, I kind of immediately go to a place of, if someone, for let's say financial reasons or health or insurance reasons, can't get access to a physician, that I'm in 110% agreement with you that clinical research as a potential care option, which CRAPCO is not a good acronym for it.
Maybe
But
more appropriate, but not as
right.
sexy.
But if you have a situation like that, that is a very, very elegant solution where, certainly with enough, explanation through the informed consent process, knowing that maybe something that they're getting is a placebo, maybe it's standard of care, which might be fine with them. It might be this experimental thing they're excited about, except it might not work, or it might be unsafe. So the potential there, I think, is where there's kind of the hook, right? If you have no other option. If that same patient doesn't have access to a physician for other reasons, disinterest, that kind of stuff, I don't think that it's going to be easier to get to a clinical research site than it is to a physician. Like, if you can't get to a physician, you're probably not going to wind up in a clinical research study.
Well, yeah, we've seen examples where, if we're enrolling patients in a trial that's for a disease state that was, like, for example, we did a trial with lower limb amputees. Well, obviously there's trauma, which is one thing, but then there's, diabetic, and the reason that happens is because they didn't take very good care. They weren't compliant. They didn't take very good care of themselves. They didn't see a doctor. Well, guess what? They're not the greatest research participants because, they don't follow up. They don't do what they're asked to do, and they become, very, very challenging to guide through the clinical research journey, so to speak. So I'd say that's a very accurate take.
Yeah, you use that example. I actually had some in my life several years ago that would have fit that bill perfectly, and I'm in my mind's eye just thinking, what would clinical research stuff would look like for them, and in terms of the huge benefit, which is often the very reason patients drop out. But patients that stay in a trial, the very benefit is the structure to it. Sort of like anything else, exercise, diet, whatever, consistency, structure, actually doing the stuff. No one really quite enjoys filling out, a daily ePro for 2 years. But the benefit of that is, if you're filling out a daily ePro for 2 years, you're probably much more in tune with whatever's going on than someone that's not filling that says, that's too much burden. And, it's operational burden. I'm not saying that we should be, deploying those burdensome things, but if we're truly trying to help a patient in terms of their health, then maybe some of those operational things are not as bad as we've made them out to be. And they're actually part of the, they dropped out. Like, this person dropped out because of that, but this person actually stayed in and did really good because they had to do, a finger stick every day
it's like an enforced discipline, to self-discipline in a way to I get what you're saying. Yeah, no. Yeah. And I do think too, I mean, for better or worse, perceived benefit makes a big difference, right? I mean, if they feel like, oh, this is doing something that I've gotten help where I've not gotten help before, that obviously keeps people on the line, but that's not really the line that you guide people through research with, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah. And I just want to add, so I was a patient in the 2-3 Pfizer vaccine trial. I've talked about it previously. Different type of trial, obviously, different time, entirely different ecosystem of stuff going on, as you might expect. How can I phrase this? I lost the thought.
No worries. No worries. There's some other questions here if you want to jump in.
Sorry.
I'm actually
I know exactly what I was going to say in 30 seconds. That world of people that have never heard of clinical research before, learning about clinical research, was for a time really, really good. Like for people to actually understand that there's an entire body of humans that are overseeing something, and the people that are actually doing the quote unquote testing are physicians seeing and nurses seeing patients, right? And there's huge safeguards. Frankly, the argument can be way too many, but there's huge safeguards. And then getting all that data collected, analyzed, and into a CSR, and then into integrated analyses to a regulatory body where there's so much scrutiny, where you can join the webcast for the advisory committee. So many people that I know that never heard of clinical research, and frankly, for the last 20 years, don't know what the hell I do. They would be like, "Oh my God, like that's amazing. I had no idea that stuff was going on. Like clinical research actually is really cool." Like, of course, things get politicized, et cetera, and then that takes the shine off that. But I will say, just that experience of being a patient in a trial, the experience of really seeing people around me that started learning about clinical research and really understanding that it wasn't just, we're just forcing people to do stuff.
Right.
Eye-opening for them, they were saying. So
yeah, I just make up a new job every time somebody asks me what I do, because it's I always find it so challenging to like actually. I start explaining one thing and then I feel like I have to explain the whole thing, and then their eyes glaze over and it's been half an hour and I'm like, okay, well, sorry about that. And even then, like I oftentimes think, like, if I wasn't in this field, I don't know that I would be in a trial without knowing what I know. You know what I mean? And that made me say more about me than clinical research, but I just think it's something that's occurred to me, throughout the years. But take another question here. Why are we using paper? I mean, why haven't we seen, anything being adopted at scale yet? I mean, I'm sure that this is a fairly generic answer, but I mean, I know that even in the FDA guidance from like 10 years ago, that direct data capture was pretty much addressed in a way that it seemed like they're cool with it. So, I mean, why have we still yet to see something that's really well adopted?
Yeah, I think, and we should have Jonathan Helfgott on.
Yeah, I just talked to him earlier today, as a matter of fact.
Okay, yeah, so there you go. So I mean, he was the co-author of that, and knows it better than anyone. But it was really, particularly my data days. It was like my data days was like the everyday go-to of like, are we in compliance? Are we actually doing, like, what does this actually mean? And there's, according to him, there's actually a ton of misinterpretation in the pharma and CRO world. And like, I'm not speaking for him, but like, if he stood up and said, this is exactly what was meant, people still would be like, I disagree with you. And it's sort of like but I'm saying this is what we meant. So it's kind of a weird world there. But the paper thing, this could be a very long answer. I'm not very concise, as you know. But the paper thing, if we're talking about developed society, first world countries, internet connectivity all the time, except for when AWS has a problem. When we're talking about paper, we're talking about it as something that we're also using that jots something down or makes something a little easier. We don't have to go into some specific, just almost jotting down stuff, right? Like that, it seems to be the world of paper, right? Then you take second and certainly third world countries, and they have seen this specifically, where they don't have the infrastructure that we have and take for granted on an everyday basis. So deploying tech in different communities in sub-Saharan Africa, in certain areas of South America, in certain areas of Asia, is way different than here. So from the paper versus non-paper piece, like there's high saturation of EDC, but it's still not 100%. It's not even close. It's like 91, 92% if you added up all the studies and all the sites and users and denominators and numerators and did the math. you would find that like, wow, EDC is like 22, 23 years old, something like that. And we still aren't at 100% saturation. The way more nuanced one, and again, love for John to be on your show to explain this, but why not just do direct data capture into an EDC system? I think the answer still comes back to, if you're a research site, it might be different, but if you're a research and healthcare, entering data into the EHR and then entering it into Rave or some other EDC system, the direct data capture would be, let me go into Rave, and then you still have to go into your EHR. You're just switching, you're still doing two systems, right? It could definitely look different where a research site says, our EHR is also our EDC system, or is also something that we tell a sponsor that like we can, get them the data, or there's some other mechanism where then they can do direct data capture. But to me, that's where you have a specific site that is doing only research that has found a solution that works for them. But in terms of how many other people are in that same exact situation with the same exact system being picked for their data capture, working with certain sponsors, that there's way too many permutations and combinations. I just wanted to say
that's fair. Well, I want to spin one more question off of that before we get here towards the end. But so, I mean, in all of this, what role do you see sites having in bringing their own, technology or their own applications to the table, rather than standing back and saying, okay, we have Rave for this study, we use MedRio over here, we use this study, for this, that, and the other. At what point do sites say, hey, we have our own data collection, system, eSource, whatever the case is, you can take the data, or, we have our own eConsent, we have our own this, that, and the other, we have our own stack, and sponsors can take that data and do with it what they please. But do you see that as a reasonable future, or what role do you see for that, if any?
Yeah, I think there's a couple dimensions here. One is, when you said sites bring their own tech, I almost went to a place of like, well, they're not a software company. They're not developing their own tech. Like, they're still getting commercial products, right? So, but if we, just focus on that, basically, the way I've seen it is there's this power dynamic between who's funding a study, so a sponsor, and who is getting paid for services in the trial, whether it's a CRO or professional services through a tech company or a site. I think that power dynamic would basically just kind of prohibit large scale sites bring their own stuff. With that being said, there's certainly, I think, easier systems where that could happen, right? So a site saying, listen, we pay our patients through this particular way. The sponsor could say, you know what, we actually have a system for site and patient payments. We'll just use the site payments piece of it. And sure, you take care of the rest. And so something like that, far easier, I think, than bringing a direct data capture EDC-ish type system into play. But I think maybe the systems that focus more on the purely operational component, that don't contain clinical data that's actually going to be analyzed for safety and efficacy, and contains important data, but operational data, stuff that if you had downtime, for my monitoring friends will kill me, but if you had downtime for a CTMS for a day, would there be some huge, problem? Far less than if you had downtime for a day for an EDC system. So I think there's a spectrum of things that are more or less applicable, but overall, I think the power balance is preventative.
Sure. Yeah. And that's
I'd love to hear your perspective.
I don't know. This is where I'm like really in a interesting place, because on the one hand, I look around and I see all these new vendors and all these new solutions coming around, and Some great, some look like shit. It's hard to kind of make heads or tails of it. But as a site, I'm thinking like, crap, what am I in for here? Right? It's going to get worse before it gets better in terms of things I'm sort of forced to use. But I feel like to some degree, can I differentiate myself as a site by having my own, or not? Again, to your point, I'm not developing software, but adopting or partnering with someone that creates some consistency for me operationally as a site, and then could still potentially shoot that data through to the sponsor. Maybe not exactly how they want it through their EDC, but again, I don't know enough on the back end to know what that means or doesn't mean, or if it's possible, or if it's complicated, or what.
Yeah, it almost begs the question of, the pecking order of who a study caters to. Coming from another galaxy, if you looked at this, you would say, well, it's got to be the patient is like the top, right? Like that's the person, that's what you're designing everything towards. And what has it traditionally been? The complete opposite.
Right.
There's entire industries, or an entire industry, which I won't mention by name, but there's an entire industry built on inefficiency. It's inefficiency.
Yeah, I'll name it.
Inefficiency is specifically why it continues to be, I think,
make a crap load of money off that inefficiency. Yeah. Yes, no question. Right. Yeah, I mean, again, that's what I find frustrating is that, a lot of sponsors are really a lot more reasonable than you think, because we are sort of gate kept oftentimes as sites to talking to the sponsors, whether that's by design or just a side effect of the, hierarchy, if you will. Because I find so often when we talk to sponsors, they're very reasonable, willing to be open to different payment terms or different ways of doing things, but you never would have known that unless you really went out of your way to go track that person down. And you're like, well, shit, this could have been much simpler, but I was led to believe it had to be done this way, and that's not serving any of us. I mean, it's filling up somebody's pockets, no question, but that may make it difficult to attack in any, meaningful way, because somebody's got a lot to lose if things change. But I mean, it sucks, right? It just sucks.
Yeah. And frankly, some of the problems that we have look so gargantuan that, for any given person to want to do their part in it, it's a lot of effort, right? People, even forgetting the past few years, what do people want to do, generally speaking, right? We want to have a pretty enjoyable job. We want to have, friends, family, we want to have fun. How many people are really focused on, changing the paradigm of clinical research, and then having the tenacity to follow that through for a long time, right? It's a daunting task.
Yeah, it's a grind if someone's willing to take it on. It's not going to happen.
Yeah, I think tomorrow. I was going to say, I think the silver lining is that, like, almost literally to a person, Brad, like when I think of pharma companies and tech companies and CROs and sites and all the other players, they're made up of people. And we know these people and we talk to these people. And like you just said, they're often more than reasonable, right? On an individual level. But as you aggregate that into, well, this is the way things have always been done at, Acme Co., it becomes nothing about them and their, being nice or not. And way more about just that this is the way it's always been done kind of stuff. So, I implore every executive leader, CEO of these companies to, top down, essentially just say, we need to make things better. And if you're not into making things better, then you're not going to be here. Then go find some place that doesn't want to make things better. There's certainly risk to that, but
yeah, no, it's true. It's true. It's again, it's just a real interesting time again, where we're at some sort of interesting inflection point. I think, the pandemic, and then all the sort of DCT movement, all the new vendors to the market. It just makes it a very, I'm going to say I'll have cautious optimism, but still reserve the right to be cynical and skeptical about all these things as they come through. But ultimately, my role is to serve patients and sponsors at the same time, sort of be that in between, and how it is. The user is never the buyer in this field. It's just not how it works. But to your point, I would say to everybody, like, everybody just keep talking to each other and figuring out where these gaps are, because they exist, and they exist on a way bigger scale than you would imagine. The assumptions that are made, I still every day realize, like, false assumptions I have about CROs and sponsors. And I have to think, in the conversations I've had with sponsors, they're oftentimes surprised by the false assumptions they have too, I think the only hope we have is all sort of, cutting through the shit and just being real with each other, and really figuring out where these problems lie, so that we can start to attack them,
Yeah, agreed. I mean, in my 20 years, this is and perhaps it's the connectedness of our world now than 20 years ago, but I'm just seeing so many more people voicing what the problems are and voicing potential solutions. And look, a lot of times they seem additive, fine, but take a look at your phone. How many individual pieces of software do you have on that phone, in that operating system? 50, 100 apps, and so many of them do. That's the same thing. It's just why couldn't you done that in YouTube? You had to do it in TikTok or on Instagram or on LinkedIn.
Right.
There's so many solutions that are so overlapping or adjacent that's kind of our world now. But the beauty of it is how many people are talking about this stuff and making it top of mind, and making it something that we're at least trying to collaboratively figure out. So yeah, that's the silver lining to me.
Yeah, I like it. I think it's a good place for us to wrap up here. Where can people find you?
Sure, they're certainly welcome to reach out on LinkedIn. You can shoot me an email to my Gmail, Craig.Serra@gmail. You can Craig.Serra@Flatiron. Any one of those places. But thank you so much, Brad, for having me. It's been a privilege. Sorry the internet went out for a couple minutes, but
we're all good.
Hope I wasn't as long-winded as I normally am.
No, man, not at all. I thought it was great, and I really appreciate you coming on. And thanks, everybody in the audience. Thanks for your questions, and we'll be back next week.
Awesome.